Julius Evola. Synthesis of a Racial Doctrine. Second part, The 3 Degrees of the Doctrine of Race. First chapter, Different Meanings of Race. Whilst in a purebred horse or cat the biological element constitutes the central one, and therefore any racist consideration can legitimately be restricted to it, such is certainly not the case for man or, at least, for every man worthy of the name, who is a biological and anthropological reality, but connected to elements and forces and laws of a different, supra-biological, character, as real as the former, and whose influence on the former can often be decisive. Therefore, neither the racist consideration of man can stop at a purely biological level, nor, wanting to go beyond it, should it lead the initial spiritualistic and qualitative instance into a materialism that repeats, mutatis mutandis, the psychoanalytical or Darwinian reduction of the superior to the inferior, that is, to suppose a unilateral dependence of the psychic and supra-biological part of the human being on the biological part. It is in this case, and only in this case, that racism really deserves the accusation, made by the Jew Trotsky, of zoological materialism. The fact is that the concept of race is a concept with very distinct meanings according to the category of beings to which one refers. Not only does it not mean the same in the case of an animal species or of man, but it also has a different value in the case of the very varieties of humanity, since it certainly cannot designate the same thing in a savage tribe or in a super race. It is not enough either to say, like Walter Gross, that the concept of race means to us that completeness of human life, in which body and spirit, matter and soul are composed in a superior unity, but, as for deciding whether one of the two things is determined by the other, if the bodily form is determined by the soul, or vice versa, this is an extra-scientific, metaphysical problem, which should not be considered by racism. Even less satisfying is Alfred Rosenberg's statement, we do not agree either with the proposition that the spirit creates the body, or the reverse, that is, that the body creates the spirit. There is no clear border between the spiritual world and the physical world. When race is no longer to be considered a myth, but must be the object of a doctrine, one cannot stop at this point. It should also be noted, and this is no small matter, that, in the end, we do not go beyond materialism, when we do not simply speak of race in the more limited anthropological and biological sense of the term, but we also speak of a spirit of the race, to the point of formulating a mystique of the blood. In order to have something valid, even here, further delimitations would be necessary. In fact, it is easy to see that a mysticism of blood is also found in the lower types of human society, being characteristic for many savage communities of the totemic type. The totem here is nothing more than the mystical soul of the tribe and horde, felt, however, in close relation with a given animal species. It is conceived by individuals as the soul of their soul, as the primary element within them. Here the individual, before perceiving himself as such, feels as a group, race or tribe, but in a collectivistic sense, drawing from this his distinctive, not only biological, but also characterological and, to the extent that we can speak about it here, cultural and spiritual, fundamental traits. Even at such a stage, no clear difference is made between spirit and body, both being experienced in an indistinct, promiscuous unity. From this, it is clear that one can go seriously astray, without realizing it, when one proceeds from confused conceptions of race and of the mysticism of race, such as those mentioned above, in fighting universalism and rationalism. Here we run the risk of taking as an ideal something that, despite all appearances, leads back to forms of naturalist and pre-personal life, and then to promote a real involution. And this is all the more clear in the reference to the traditional view, according to which savages, in the majority of cases, do not represent at all the primitives, the original forms of humanity, but instead represent the last degenerative, materialized, brutalized, residues of previous races and civilizations of a superior type. Thus it would be easy to show that totemism, of which we have already spoken, is only the degenerative and nocturnal form into which a very different mysticism of blood has fallen, that which took shape in the aristocratic cult of the heroes or semi-gods of various peoples, and, to a certain extent, also of the Lares and the manes of patrician Romanity. From this, it is clear that more precise points of reference need to be provided. Second chapter, The 3 Degrees of the Doctrine of Race. It has been said that the concept of race has different meanings not only with respect to man and an animal species, but also with respect to various human types. So we must make a first, fundamental distinction between races of nature and races in the highest, human and spiritual sense. And from the methodological point of view, we must be convinced that it is absurd to consider racism as a discipline in itself, rather than in strict dependence on a general theory of the human being. The character of the doctrine of race also depends on the way in which the human being is conceived. If it is a materialistic way, this materialism will be passed on to the concept of race itself. If it is spiritualistic, even the doctrine of race will be spiritualistic, because, even considering what in the human being is material and conditioned by the laws of matter, the doctrine of race will never forget the hierarchical place and the functional dependence that this part has in the whole of the human being. From the fact that the presumed objectivity of the research conducted scientifically, with the ostentatious exclusion of the metaphysical problems, far from not having presuppositions, as it claims, is, often without realizing it, invalidated by those of the materialistic and profane conception of the world and of man proper to the positivism and Darwinism of the last century. From this fact proceed, in some racist expositions, certain one-sided claims and deformations, from which the adversary naturally tries to take as much advantage as possible. For our part, since we want to talk about the doctrine of race from a traditional point of view, we will naturally assume as a premise the traditional conception of the human being, according to which man, as such, is not reduced to purely biological, instinctive, hereditary, naturalistic determinisms. If all this plays its part, neglected by a suspect spiritualism, exaggerated by a short-sighted positivism, the fact remains that man stands apart from animals in that he participates in a supernatural, supra-biological element, on the basis of which he can be free in himself. The soul lies between one and the other, as a somehow intermediate element. The distinction in the human being of three different principles, body, soul, and spirit, is fundamental to the traditional view. In a more or less complete form, it is found in the teachings of all ancient traditions, and it continued in the Middle Ages. The Aristotelian and scholastic conception of the three souls, vegetative, sensory, and intellectual, the Hellenic trinity of soma, psyche and nous, the Roman one of mens, anima and corpus, the Indo-Aryan one of sainthula, linga and karana sarira, and so on, are as many equivalent expressions. And it is important to underline, that this view should not be considered as a particular philosophical interpretation among many, to be discussed, criticized or compared with others, but as an objective and impersonal knowledge, adhering to the very nature of things. For some clarification of the three concepts, we can mention that spirit, in the traditional conception, has always meant something supra-rational and supra-individual. It has therefore nothing to do with the common intellect, and even less with the pallid world of thinkers and men of letters. It is rather the element on which rests every virile asceticism and every heroic elevation, every effort to achieve, in life, what is more than life. In classical antiquity, spirit, as nous or animus, was opposed to the soul as a masculine principle to a feminine principle, a solar element to a lunar element. The soul belongs more to the world of becoming than to that of being. It is connected to the vital force as well as to every perceptive faculty and to every passionate faculty. With its unconscious ramifications, it establishes the connection between spirit and body. The Indo-Aryan expression for a given aspect of it, linga sarira, which has its equivalent in that of the subtle body of some Western schools, properly designates the set of formative forces, more than corporeal and less than spiritual, at work in the physical organism, where hereditary influences are most active and where the acquired elements of new heredities are formed. By analogy, the human triad spirit-soul-body corresponds to the cosmic triad of sun-moon-earth. From this point of view, we must recognize that the inequality of the human races is not only physical, biological or anthropological, but also psychic and spiritual. Human beings are different not only in body, but also in soul and spirit. In accordance with this, the doctrine of race must be articulated in 3 degrees. The racial problem must therefore be posed for each of the 3 elements. The racist consideration of man as a body, as a purely natural and biological entity, is the task of the doctrine of race of the 1st degree. This is followed by the consideration of man as a soul, that is, the study of the race of the soul. As a culmination, there will be a doctrine of race of the 3rd degree, that is, the racial study of man inasmuch as he is not only body or soul, but, in addition, spirit. Only then will the doctrine of race be complete, and it will be very easy to overcome various confusions and to reject attacks which, taking advantage of the one-sided materialistic tendencies into which it sometimes falls, are moved against racism by a suspect and liberalizing spiritualism.